We are talking today with Eric Klinenberg. Start out and tell us, what was the motivation in writing your new book, Fighting for Air?
Well, I'd spent a lot of time talking to people about the quality of media in this country, and I kept hearing friends and colleagues say, well, we're concerned about media consolidation. And I tried to ask, well, what does media consolidation actually mean for you and for this country? How does it affect our lives? And people would generally respond to me by telling me about this magazine story they'd seen or a chart somewhere where you got a list of like 5 or 6 big companies, and they were presented in kind of web-like fashion, and you could see the hundreds of little companies, or actually big companies, that were subsidiaries, and you got a picture from looking at these charts of this world in which a very small number of corporations owned lots and lots and lots of media outlets, and we were told this is a dangerous thing. But when I said, how do you connect the dots and explain how this has changed your life and the media you consume, oftentimes I found people failed to come up with a good answer. And I realized part of the problem is that so many of us depend on the mainstream media to get those kinds of stories. When we share a narrative with a friend, it's because we've read something in our newspaper, or we've seen an expose on a television show, or heard a long story on the radio. But major media companies don't report on the operations of major media companies, especially in the kind of political domain, and especially when it comes to their business interests. And so I decided I wanted to look closely at this, and I spent 5 years traveling around the country asking people to think about what has happened to their own local media in that period. So, to begin, I ask, what's happened to your local radio stations in Seattle? What's happened to your local television stations? What about your local newspapers, or alt weeklies even? And that's an interesting story here. I started to change the scale of that discussion, in other words, about media consolidation, to understand how it hits home. And then I asked people, well, what are you doing about it, if anything? And I discovered, to my amazement at the time, the beginning of this extraordinary media reform movement, an incredibly fast-growing, bipartisan political project of Americans saying, we want and deserve, we demand a better, more local, more accountable media system, and it's fighting all these battles today. And so that's how I came up with Fighting for Air.
So what do you see as key pieces of history that kind of brought us to where we are today? For instance, like the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
Yeah. Well, an important part of the story is that this media system that we live in now is not a natural system, ordained by God and the powers that be. It's not even a deep-seated part of American history. We have, in the last 20 years, radically transformed the American system of broadcasting, of producing newspapers, and it's not just a story of the rise of the internet. For example, very few people know that 20 years ago, it was illegal for any major media company, or any media company, to own more than 1 AM, 1 FM, and 1 television station in the same market. That was it. 10 years ago, in 1996, it was illegal for any company to own more than 4 radio stations at the local level and more than 40 stations at the national level. The idea in this country is that we wanted to have a corporate media system. We decided we would break from a lot of European nations that had more public investments in broadcasting, in journalism, and we would have a corporate system. But the key to making corporate media work, the kind of early American broadcast media policy people thought, was to make sure that in every city you had a lot of local competition, you had a diversity of voices that went over the airwaves, you had public interest standards that anyone who had a license to broadcast had to meet, and you had a commitment to local coverage. Those were built into our policy objectives. Well, we switched from that in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and we said, now in radio, for example, we're going to allow one company to own 8 radio stations in the same market, and that means far less local competition. We said we're not even going to cap the national ownership limits. We're going to say you can buy as many stations as you want. So let's just start with the radio industry. From 1996 to 1998, 40% of the nation's broadcast radio stations, the commercial stations, changed hands. It was an incredible feeding frenzy in the market once the ownership caps were removed. A couple of companies emerged and owned hundreds. And actually, one company, Clear Channel Communications, which no one had heard of in 1996, acquired 1,200 stations, plus lots of other parts of the radio business, which I can describe. And they all decided that the way to make media more profitable, and this is kind of where we get this concept of big media, is that we would start to replace the costs, the people that cost so much money in a media business, namely DJs, local radio talk people, the local staffs that had produced information about the places where we lived, and substitute for them syndicated programs, pre-recorded automated programs. There's a thing called voice tracking, and with voice tracking technology, stations could put someone like you, a DJ, a talk host, in any studio anywhere in the world, so long as they had a computer. And in about 20 minutes' time, you could create a broadcast designed for any city on Earth that would run for 4 or 5 hours, because you wouldn't have to listen to the whole song if you're playing music. You could do your little voiceovers. You could create time for the commercials. And literally, rather than have one employee work a full day and put out a 4 or 5 hour show that was live and local and original, you could have one employee sit in an office somewhere and do 8, 10, or 12 programs in one day. So the economy of scale changed things. And as they became more sophisticated, companies like Clear Channel decided, well, we can actually fake local reports. We can pretend as if our DJs are in the towns where our listeners are, and that, I argue, changed the sound of American radio. It used to be that you could go to Philadelphia, turn on the radio, and hear the sound of Philadelphia. If I say close your eyes and think about Chicago, you could hear the sounds and the voices of Chicago. New Orleans, Detroit, San Francisco, Seattle. These are towns that have distinctive traditions, and the radio was a huge part of that. Well, after 1996, local DJs were basically obliterated. It became much more difficult for local bands to get their music broken on the airwaves. And the result is Kiss FM, golden oldies, the mix, classic rock. We can go to any city and hear the same songs and even the same DJs. And I think this is a profound cultural loss.
So expand on the example of Clear Channel a bit more. Are they the epitome of what's going wrong?
Well, Clear Channel Communications is a fascinating company. They have become, in some ways, the poster child for what's gone wrong since the 1996 Telecommunications Act. This is a company that owned 40 stations in 1996 and then went to more than 1,200. But they also spread themselves across the industry, the radio, the advertising, and entertainment industry. So a lot of people know that Clear Channel owns stations. But Clear Channel also owns Premier Radio Network, which is the largest syndicator service. So basically, they own the program, the Rush Limbaugh Show or Dr. Laura. There's dozens of programs that they own, and in fact, more than half of commercial radio stations in this country depend on Clear Channel's Premier networks for their programming. So their presence is enormous. They also own a company called Live Nation, which is the largest entertainment venue for live concerts. So basically, Clear Channel, in addition to the radio stations, they control the places where musicians play when they go to do a concert. And a lot of musicians complain that they feel pressure from the industry that if they don't tour with Live Nation, they might not get their music played at the same level on Clear Channel's radio stations. Clear Channel also owns an organization called Katz Media Services, which sells advertising packages in bulk to local and national companies. And they also own an outdoor advertising outfit, which owns billboards everywhere. I mean, if you look up around Seattle, you'll probably notice the Clear Channel name on a lot of outdoor ad space. What that means is, if you're a small competitor, if you are a mom and pop radio station, it's incredibly difficult to vie with Clear Channel because, they can provide bulk advertising packages to deep-pocketed clients in local markets. They can pressure musicians to play in their concert venues or to come to town and go to their stations to do their promotions. It's very difficult. And so we saw, since 1996, a dramatic drop in the number of locally owned stations, a dramatic drop in the number of minority-owned stations, a dramatic drop in the number of female-owned stations. Really, radio moved through Clear Channel from this kind of mom-and-pop industry to a giant industry. Now, musicians have been concerned about Clear Channel because of the force that they play in the industry. It's always been the case that the way to break as a performing arts group is to have some local DJ listen to your music and find out about the music you're doing through local shows and the buzz in town, and have that person come out and get to know you, maybe bring you on the air for an interview, maybe start playing a lot of your records. And the idea in the kind of American informational artery system that the media works as is that the really good stuff would kind of percolate up through the system. And of course, as the media becomes more top-down, more centralized, as local DJs disappear, there are fewer ears on the ground listening to the sounds in the place you live. It makes it much more difficult for a local band to pop. But also, the top-down system favors a cultural market where the way to get in is to be represented by a major label with a major agency and to have a performance before the programmers at a national station. It becomes a more pop market phenomenon, and that's now an industry that favors the 3-minute and 30-second song that can appeal to every demographic and can be played across stations rather than the distinctive local sound. So a lot of musicians worry that this is not just bad for my band, it's also bad for the music industry. It makes the sounds of this country less diverse and interesting. A number of performers also say that Clear Channel's had a heavy-handed political presence. For example, it's supported rallies for America to support the war in Iraq. It's notorious for having eliminated a number of personalities on the air, both liberals and also conservatives, immediately after they began speaking out against the war. So there's another story with Clear Channel's outdoor advertising firm where they refused to allow a peace organization, an anti-war organization, to put an anti-war advertisement up in Times Square around the time of the Republican convention in 2004. And so this is an organization that's got deep ties to the Bush administration, to the Republican Party, and that has made a mark on our cultural scene in ways that I think very few of us understand. But when you're in the industry and you listen to DJs talk about the friends that they've seen lose their jobs, or radio reporters who've lost their jobs, or if you're in the music industry and you hear about what's happened on the air, Clear Channel's a kind of a 4-letter name.
And in addition to radio, are you seeing similar patterns like the Clear Channel model across the board?
I am, and I think this is another story that we just don't get reported, but which we need to know. In the television industry, for example, I tell the story of a company called the Sinclair Broadcast Group in Fighting for Air. Now, Sinclair you might have heard of from the 2004 elections. Again, this is the company that refused to allow its ABC affiliates to air the Nightline program where Ted Koppel read the names of the American war casualties in Iraq. They literally wouldn't let their ABC stations across the country put that show on the air. They also really achieved notoriety in the weeks right before the election. Sinclair said they were going to air this Stolen Honor documentary, which was the Swift Boat documentary, alleging that John Kerry had, this kind of caused more violence in Vietnam. So they had a major impact on the national political scene in 2004. But what we don't hear is Sinclair actually owns more local television stations than any other company. They are the nation's leading owner of local television stations. And the real innovation that they made in the media market was to adapt this kind of Clear Channel style, fake local news system for the television medium. So I went to their central studio, which is in suburban Baltimore, and they had put together this operation they called News Central. And in News Central, Sinclair produced a fake local news story, essentially, for cities across the country. And I went down, for example, to the meteorology studios, and they had a bunch of studios lined up next to each other. And they said, well, instead of having a weatherman in every city, let's have a centralized operation here, and we'll get meteorologists, and they'll do the weather report for 4 or 5 cities in the same afternoon. And they have a bookshelf full of atlases and a pronunciation guide so they can make sure they get the names right for places where they've never been. And they'd get up in front of this digital camera and they'd talk about the storm in Buffalo, the rain in Pittsburgh, the cool air in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as if they were sharing the experience. But of course they weren't. They were in a studio outside of Baltimore. Now, the News Central model was a disaster. It was a disaster for residents who literally didn't know that they were getting fake product. But it also turned out ultimately to be a disaster for Sinclair, because one of the things that companies like Clear Channel and Sinclair learned just recently is that Americans don't want this kind of fake content, that we actually have a demand for genuine local news and information, and that we feel like we lose something when they give us central casting. Now, the problem is, in the radio industry, for example, a lot of young people I've talked to have just tuned off. I mean, they've given up on commercial radio altogether. I teach at NYU, and the other day I was talking to my students, about 50 people, and I said, how many of you listen to commercial music radio? 2 people raised their hand. I mean, they've just given up. It's been a boon for, public stations, but for commercial radio, it's a problem. A lot of people also are turning away from their local television stations. They're turning off from the newspaper industry, where you see similar kinds of things, a downsizing of the newsroom and less locally reported stories, more AP Wire stories, more syndicated columnists, things like this. So we all have heard the story of how the internet and new media are pulling us away from the old media, and there's some truth to that. But one of the messages that I have in Fighting for Air is that we've also been pushed away by content that clearly does not serve our needs or interests.
If you listen to the people that say the market economy will solve all our problems, then based on what you just said, one would expect, well, if people are not listening to commercial radio or watching commercial television, then those entities will financially suffer and the system will correct itself.
Yeah. The market argument about the future of media, unfortunately, has not proven to be all that accurate. First of all, are Americans getting the kind of media they demand? Well, Americans don't demand 20 minutes of commercial time for every hour of commercial radio. I mean, I've never heard someone say that they like that. Actually, they started to get that when their radio markets became less competitive, because you see, the whole argument about a market-based media system depends on this idea that markets are actually competitive and robust. And the argument I make is that our market system has failed, that actually, if you live in a city that has a monopoly newspaper, there's nowhere to go for local news if the local newspaper decides to fire lots of reporters and replace the standard cookie-cutter content with it. If you have a radio market where there's 2 or 3 companies that own 90% of the stations, oligopolies, and that's what we have in so many American cities today, all you can do is go off the air to the public stations, or you can tune out radio altogether and go to your iPod, which a lot of younger people have done. Now, unfortunately, there's very little evidence that the kind of alternative media sources we have today are actually adequately substituting for what we have lost. And that's particularly true when it comes to journalism. And I think I have a controversial take on this position. I love blogs. I love going to the internet. I'm kind of as addicted as anybody. But I also know that there's something about professionally reported journalistic stories, about an investigative report that can take weeks or months or even a year to do, about steady beat coverage of malfeasance at City Hall, or what's happening on the school board, or what about aggressive investigative coverage of local businesses like the Enrons of Houston, for example, or the Clear Channels of San Antonio. The Seattle Times has done some important investigative work on problems in the medical system in Seattle. Questions about the ethics of research at leading hospitals. Now, as much as I love blogs, there are not a lot of bloggers who are capable of doing that kind of research and reporting and carefully done work. It requires a lot of time. It requires resources. It requires certain kinds of skills. Often it requires the backing, because I can tell you, if you try to challenge the business practices of the most powerful institutions on earth, they will bite back. And it's not clear that it's easy to do that without the backing of a major organization. So we need to remember that, journalists didn't just kind of appear with Adam and Eve on Earth. The history of journalism is the struggle of a profession to establish itself as a check on powerful institutions and actors that had every reason to want them out of the picture. Right? If you're a major business owner, you don't want to be critically covered by a news organization. If you're the mayor of a city or the governor of a state, you don't want a big news organization checking out what you're doing. When we lose our mainstream media, when they do cookie cutter content, if they drive us away and they fall into a crisis, we collectively lose because we benefit from aggressive reporting even when we don't read it. I mean, if you live in a city where there are 2 newspapers and they're doing good critical coverage, the powerful institutions in your city have to act with the expectation that they might be uncovered, that someone might be watching them. If you live in a city where there's no one doing that kind of work, powerful agencies will try to get away with whatever they can, and you will suffer from that even if you don't buy the newspaper or watch television news. So, do we have a pure market system? No, we don't have a pure market system. Even if we did, do we have a market system that's allowing the good stuff to get to the top and filtering out companies that we don't need? I mean, no, that's another argument I make too. When you have a couple of companies that dominate particular urban scenes, it's very difficult to move them out.
Eric, in the beginning of your book, you actually you give an example of a community that was directly affected by the lack of local ownership of radio. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and it's an important point because one of the major issues in the media policy movement and also in national policy has to do with security, homeland security, and how well protected we are from future crises and what we would do if something went terribly wrong. We're obviously investing billions of dollars at the national level to make sure that we are a more secure nation. It's a big political issue. And one of the surprising things I found in the book is that our security during a disaster depends to some great extent on the success of our communication system. Consolidation has meant real trouble for communication during disasters. And the opening story of the book takes place in Minot, North Dakota, which is a town of about 37,000 people. 5 years ago, just January 2002, a train traveling through Minot in the early morning hours derailed, and it spilled about 240,000 gallons of anhydrous ammonia, a highly toxic chemical. The ammonia quickly consolidated itself and formed a toxic cloud about 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. It started floating over the homes of people in town, and it penetrated the homes of about 15,000 people. Well, anhydrous is really dangerous. If you breathe it in, it burns your respiratory system, it burns your eyes, it can burn your skin. If you breathe in enough of it, it can kill you. And people's instinct is to try to get around it somehow, and that oftentimes means trying to go through it really quickly. But that's a terrible thing to do because you expose yourself to it. And if you try to drive through it, the anhydrous can literally shut down the engine of your car. So what authorities needed to do is to make sure that people understood, stay in your homes, don't try to get around this, seal the windows and doors to the extent that you can, maybe get into an interior room like a bathroom, seal the window, run fresh water, just try not to breathe in this stuff. Now, normally the way that you would get that information out is you would turn on the radio, you'd activate the emergency alert system, and you'd make sure the radio broadcasters put a message out. Actually, we've done that since the Cold War. Harry Truman instituted a program called CONORAD, which some listeners might remember, which was basically a radio warning system. And they said, since radio companies have this broadcast license, and since they're able to make so much money by using a public resource, the airwaves, we're gonna impose this basic obligation. If there's a disaster, you have to be part of the national security system, and so the CONORAD eventually became the emergency broadcast system, and that was that. Remember that message you used to hear on the radio? Now, this is a test of the emergency broadcast system. It is only a test. Probably most of us can recite that. We used to hear it all the time. The stations had to broadcast it weekly. Recently, that got replaced by the emergency alert system, which runs similarly, but it allows local officials to override the broadcast of a station automatically. And so in Minot that morning, the people running the train, the conductors, called 911. The emergency operators tried to trigger the emergency alert system, but they had a technology failure. It wasn't communicating with the local broadcaster, the designated emergency broadcaster. And so with the EAS malfunctioning, they picked up the telephone and they called the designated emergency broadcaster. It was a company called KCJB, an AM station, it was owned by Clear Channel Communications. And actually, all 6 of the commercial, non-religious stations in town, literally all 6 of them were owned by Clear Channel, which is based in San Antonio. When they called the station, they were horrified because literally no one answered. The dispatcher in mine had told me that, I rang and rang and rang the phone and no one picked it up. They knew that they were in trouble because Clear Channel had taken these 6 stations, which had separate offices, and they moved them into 2 consolidated, centralized offices. And they had no one working the studio. They also had no one available to answer the phones. All of the stations were running on autoplay, which meant, you tune in emergency radio to find out what to do about the anhydrous gas that you're breathing in. And I got the audio tapes to all the calls to 911. I listened to people screaming in agony, people worried about a child who'd run outside, someone who thought he was dying, people who thought they were bombed. So imagine that's your situation where in your radio, you turn it on, and what you get is, "Hey, boys and girls, it's Bob O'Reilly, here for, broadcasting live from Minot, our next song." And it's just the same smooth-talking DJs, the same, big country programming, the same classic rock, the same golden oldies that you get at any hour. Now, imagine the estrangement you feel, like having a soundtrack to someone else's life, playing while you're in the midst of the biggest crisis that you've ever been in. That's what was happening in Minot that night. And they couldn't get through to the local authorities because there was no one there working in the studio. Now, unfortunately, I later discovered Minot is hardly alone in this respect. I had a conversation with a man named David Rubin, who's the dean of the journalism or the communications school at Syracuse University. And Rubin was in his office in Syracuse in August of 2003, in the day of that famous blackout. Do you remember the power outage that it swept across the Northeast and up into Canada? About 50 million people lost their power. I was in New York City. I remember losing power. From New York City, I was able to go home and turn on my battery-operated radio and get news about what was happening. And I needed it because we were worried. It was just a couple years after September 11th, and we thought, God, what's going on? Well, David Rubin went to his car from his office, and he started the car and turned on the radio, wanted to find out what was happening in Syracuse, and his all-news radio station, also owned by Clear Channel. And when he turned it on, he started getting news from New York City, which is where I was. He was hundreds of miles away. The problem was Clear Channel, just like in Minot, had centralized operations and gotten rid of lots of its radio reporters, and it didn't have people to report on what was happening in Syracuse that day. And I actually not long ago got a call from someone who used to work at a Clear Channel station in Fargo, North Dakota. In the same station now, the Clear Channel doesn't own it anymore. He told me that at the night of the Minot disaster, actually his station, 300 miles away in Fargo, had to provide news about Minot for the people of Minot on KCJB because they didn't have anyone who could do that. So the argument I'm making essentially is that when you consolidate operations and you do it by getting rid of local personalities, firing everyone in the radio reporting room, getting rid of local talent, you then have a real problem serving your public interest function when disaster strikes. And at a moment when we are investing so many national resources into making sure that we're more secure, shouldn't we be paying attention to our communication system? I mean, isn't that a crucial thing for us to be doing? Ask yourself, where would you go if disaster struck here in Seattle? How would you get news and information? Where would you turn? Who do you trust for that? Imagine that the power is out. Are you confident that your radio broadcasting system would come through for you? And that's a question that every American needs to be asking herself today.
And in fact, if you pay attention to any of the national emergency support groups, like let's say Red Cross, when you're packing your 3 days worth of food or 7 days worth of food, the one thing they always say is include a radio.
That's right.
With your
right.
supplies.
Have a battery operated or crank radio, and that's a great thing to have, but not if there's no one in the studio to tell you what's going on. I just, before I was here, was doing a radio interview at one of the largest corporate stations in town, and the host who was interviewing me said at the end of the interview, I've been here for a lot of years, and in the last 10 years, I've seen 6 of the people in our radio news department lose their jobs. We're now down to 1 person. for all of our stations. It's a company that has 5 radio stations in Seattle. They said for all of our stations, we now have 1 full-time news reporter. We used to have 6. So this is a story that has affected Seattle. I mean, Seattle is a more affluent city. It's a wealthy city. It's a large city. It's a diverse city. So it has not been as affected as places like Minot, but Seattle's hardly immune. I mean, actually, just to switch media for a second, I mean, one area where we know Seattle's not immune is in the alternative weekly market. And actually there's a chapter in the book about the chaining of the alternatives, which features a long discussion of what happened here at the Seattle Weekly. And this is a really interesting paper. The Seattle Weekly was started 30 years ago, 1976, by a guy named David Brewster, who came here after being at Yale. He was a graduate student at Yale, and he was very interested in getting kind of New Yorker-style journalism in Seattle, and he thought the alternative weekly would be a great place to do it. And Brewster's kind of a highbrow fellow. He wants to have a more educated readership. He said to me, I came here to Seattle and did a lot of interviews. He said, my ideal reader is a 35-year-old married attorney, who is an interesting, well-educated guy, and that's the market that he was going after. But he created a very distinctive newspaper. I mean, the Seattle Weekly was unmistakably a Seattle product. And well, about 20 years into this business, the market started to get a little more crowded, which is a good thing. The Weekly, while good, missed a lot of important stuff, in part because of this more highbrow orientation. So, for example, a famous story at the Seattle Weekly is that they had basically failed to cover the emergence of Sub Pop records, even though they were working in the same office complex. And then, of course, in the mid-1990s, Tim Keck comes to town and decides he's going to start The Stranger. And suddenly there's competition in the alt-weekly market, and The Stranger is a little more irreverent, more youth-oriented, more progressive, more pop culture, and Seattle Weekly's feeling a lot of pressure. And that's, in my view, a good thing. I mean, what we want in our media markets is competition, because then the companies have to reach. What they decided to do at the Weekly was to get rid of the paid model. You used to have to pay for the Weekly. They wanted to have readers who would put money down, because they thought, better to have 35,000 readers who really care about this than 100,000 readers who pick it up on their way home from work and then throw it away before they get home. So they went to the free model, and after a couple of years, they decided, we're gonna sell. This is just a different business than we wanted to. So they brought in they had a lot of suitors in the media market. One of them, actually from one of the biggest media chains around, said to them, we're interested in the alt weeklies because they're the last unconsolidated niche of the media market, which I thought was an amazing line. I was talking to Skip Berger, Newt Berger, who was the editor of the Seattle Weekly at the time, and he said, we'd go out to all these dinners with people, and we had the Chicago Reader Company came in, and the Village Voice Media Company, which at the time was based in New York, came in, and the New Times came in, and New Times was this kind of libertarian neocon company. They actually owned more alt weeklies than anyone else, and they're this very kind of like gruff, masculine, contrarian newspaper. If your idea of contrarian is like speaking Republican common sense, and Skip said to me, it was such a misfit, because here we are, the Seattle Weekly, we're kind of highbrow, we're kind of a maternal organization. The major, the editors are largely female, and here's the New Times guys who are gruff and macho and neocon. And I said, how on earth do you see this, this marriage working? And we all kind of laughed about it, and it turned out it was a terrible fit. And so when they sold Seattle Weekly, they sold it to Village Voice Media in New York, which promised to basically keep their hands off and to let the Weekly run as it was. They did a few things at the Village Voice Media. They started putting sex ads in the back of the newspaper. I mean, David Brewster would never have put a sex ad in the back of the Seattle Weekly. It was a highbrow publication. When Village Voice Media took it over, suddenly the ads started to look like the ads in all the other alt weeklies in the country, and they were upset about that. But for the most part, they allowed the Weekly to stay the Weekly. Well, in the last year, one of the big changes in the media industry is that New Times and Village Voice Media merged. And actually those gruff libertarians, the neocons from Arizona, they basically took a controlling interest in Village Voice Media. So now the Seattle Weekly is owned by the company that it rejected as a potential owner several years ago. The result, Skip Berger is no longer the editor. He resigned. And in fact, if you look at the companies, the alt weeklies that this new behemoth owns, the Village Voice, the LA Weekly, the Denver Westward, the Seattle Weekly, the San Francisco Weekly, the East Bay Express, editors and reporters are losing their jobs everywhere. They're either getting fired or resigning because the mood has changed so dramatically. This is a profoundly anti-alternative company that now owns the largest alt-weekly business in the country.
And what is the regulatory body for newspapers?
Well, there's the First Amendment law, but essentially the rules for newspapers are much looser because it's print. It's a print publication, and unlike the broadcast industry, it's not using a national resource like the airwaves. The major restriction for the newsprint business has been, since 1975, what the FCC calls the cross-ownership restriction. And this is actually really important to talk about because it's a very live issue in this year when the FCC does its media ownership hearings. Essentially, in 1975, the FCC said the two most influential and popular sources of local news and information are local news, local television news, and your local newspaper. So it would be unhealthy for any local democratic system, any local cultural system, if you had one company that could own both a broadcast television station and a newspaper. That might be a good business for them to consolidate, but it doesn't serve the public in any way. Remember, we want to have a diversity of voices as part of our media system, and that's formally a part of the FCC's mission. So they created this thing called the cross-ownership ban. It said you can't own a newspaper and a broadcast television station, and that ban has been in place for more than 30 years. Well, one of the things that Powell tried to push and failed to, and that Kevin Martin, the new chairman, is trying to push this year, is a repeal of that cross-ownership ban. They want to allow one company to own all the newspapers in town, up to 8 or maybe 10 or 12 radio stations if the radio industry gets its way, plus 3 television stations, plus the internet service, lots of websites, plus the cable television system. I mean, one corporation could literally come in and dominate a local media market. This is the issue here is about cross-ownership. Now, I cannot conceive of the public interest benefit from allowing one corporation to have so much of one city's media market. And there are a couple places that already have systems like that because there's a company, the Tribune Company, based in Chicago, my hometown, which asked the FCC for special waivers so they could set up cross-ownership operations in a few different cities. One of those cities is Los Angeles, where the Tribune's management of the LA Times has been a national disaster story. You've probably heard about it up here in Seattle because 2 editors have essentially lost their jobs or left their jobs because they were so upset about all the job cuts they had to make. Reporters, leaving or getting fired every day. Just this incredible story of hemorrhaging of journalistic quality, hemorrhaging of journalists at the LA Times. What Tribune and newspaper companies have said is, we can't sustain our business model just doing a newspaper anymore. We need to own television also so that we can have efficiencies and so that we can make enough money to stay in business. That's what Kevin Martin seems to be responding to at the FCC. In my view, the story of the crisis in the newspaper industry is greatly exaggerated, especially by the newspaper companies that have so much to gain by getting the regulations gutted. So let me give you an example, because I don't want to be glib about this. I mean, this is a real moment of transition for the newspaper industry, and the industry is struggling on many fronts. So, for example, newspapers have been losing circulation, paid circulation, for decades now. It's been a steady decline, and they're really struggling to get young readers. The newspaper stock values have been pretty stagnant over the last 10 years, and they've been down over the last couple of years, and down fairly precipitously at some of the big newspaper companies. Those are stories we hear quite a lot, right? The story we don't hear about the newspaper business is that compared to Fortune 500 companies, they're making windfalls every year. Think about this. The typical Fortune 500 corporation gets about a 6% profit margin every year. The big newspaper companies are demanding 20 or 30% profit margin. So Gannett and the major chains like to get 30% profit margins per paper. The LA Times, the story of this newspaper that's so imperiled, 20% profit margin 2 years ago. Knight Ridder 2 years ago had to be sold because investors were so upset at its performance. Its profit margins were in the mid to high teens. So the investors are demanding returns from newspapers that they don't get from any other businesses. They're wildly unrealistic. They are used to making demands like that because the newspaper industry is so monopolized that before the age of the internet, companies like Gannett established this model where they'd go to town and they'd wipe out whatever competition there was in the local newspaper business, and they would then start firing people and jacking up the ad rates, and they made newspapers profitable like never before. The times are changing now, so they're not quite as profitable, but they're still tremendously profitable. I mean, for example, 2005, the newspaper industry's revenues in this country were $47 billion. It's a big cash business. The newspaper readers are affluent. They're highly educated. They're the power elite of every city. If you think about the future online, the websites that are most popular in most cities are, yourlocalnewspaper.com is where you go for local information. So, in fact, the Newspaper Association of America says that if you include web circulation, the number of people who are reading newspaper journalism online, newspaper journalism has never been so popular or ubiquitous. So the question for the industry is, how will they survive this transition to the digital age? Can they develop a business model that will work? Those are important questions. But what I think we need to know is, they're developing more successful models for getting web advertising. My guess is that they would be able to make this transition over time. But the problem is the banking community, the financial analysts, are making such extraordinary demands on newspaper companies that they've created a kind of immediate short-term crisis. And now there's really an issue about whether the newspaper business is going to survive the next few years with all this pressure from the marketplace. It's a serious thing that affects the future of journalism, but there's no evidence that the answer to this fix, or the fix to this problem, is allowing them to own television stations and radio stations too. In fact, in the places they've done so, there have been local disasters.
Briefly expand on that. What pressure is the banking industry putting on them?
Sure. I mean, if financial analysts say to newspaper companies, we're going to recommend to our stockholders that they sell your stock, or we're going to demand a sale of the company if you don't continue to get returns of 20, 25, 30%. They want those profit margins that are so much higher than you see in other parts of the industry. And so here's an area where the financial community actually exerts tremendous influence, because if they shifted their standards and said, well, in the short term, it would be okay if newspaper companies, or even in the long term, it would be okay if newspaper companies got 10% returns, which is what, by the way, the most successful newspaper companies in the country get, like New York Times and Washington Post and Dow Jones. They're closer to 15% than they are to 30% profit margins, and that's because each of those companies, and Dow Jones owns the Wall Street Journal, but each of those companies has a tiered stock system where there's a private family that has controlling interest in the company, and they do not have to give in to pressure from organized shareholders in the same way. They can say, we're going to sacrifice a little bit of our profit for the public service mission that newspaper journalism is supposed to be about. If you had something more like that in the marketplace more generally, I think newspapers would be under far less pressure than they are today. And the big point I want to make here is that the crisis in the industry, it's not a crisis of profit margins. It's not even a crisis of profits. They're making tremendous amounts of money. I mean, would you turn down the chance to own your local newspaper? It's a crisis born from the financial industry that has to do with the stock value. And the stock value is determined by the ratings of these financial analysts who say 15%, 20% profit margins are not enough. We want 30. And we should all know that fact. But the problem is newspapers and television stations that we depend on to report issues like this don't tell us that. They report it as a crisis. And I mean, this is interesting. Why does it take a sociologist to write a book like, Fighting for Air to report on these issues? Why don't we hear about it on our network news program, since the future of democracy is at stake here? Why don't we hear about it on commercial radio, since the future of high-quality cultural entertainment and music radio is at stake? Why don't we read about it in the newspapers? Because the corporations that run those outlets have a strong vested interest. I mean, it is their ultimate vested interest in not telling us that news. It's a remarkable thing. When the newspapers report on the business of newspapers or on what's happening in the industry, it's in the business page, right? Not in the front page, not in the culture page. It's in the business page, and it's reported with respect to its consequences for the stock market value. So for example, when we read about the Tribune Company's efforts to take over more newspapers, what the business pages tell us is, well, here's what this financial analyst thinks is going to happen, or this is how it's going to affect stockholders. We don't read, here's what it means for the city of Los Angeles that the Tribune Company has taken over the LA Times and KTLA television stations and wants to merge operations. Its plans to downsize by getting rid of hundreds, if not thousands of employees. And let's talk about what this means for our news. What does it mean for our local culture? What does it mean for our civic life? What does it mean for a city when a city loses its local owner of a newspaper, right? If the Seattle Times disappeared and the Blethen family, for whatever you think about that family, was no longer part of the civic infrastructure of this city, who would fill that responsibility? Would there be local philanthropic groups that would do the same thing? And maybe the new media companies that are in Seattle would make up the difference here. I don't know. But for most cities in the country, the loss of local owners is tremendously devastating. These are policy discussions that they're not abstract, actually. They're tremendously human. We live inside the consequences of them. We can all tell stories about what's happened to our newspaper or to our radio station or to our television stations. Unfortunately, our media companies aren't telling those stories.
Luckily, in your book, in addition to the dark forces that are taking over our media, you have many examples of victories for citizens. Can you talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, and this is this amazing thing that I did not expect to discover. I set out to write this book. I really wanted to understand the stories of media consolidation, the drama of media consolidation, the way it hits home. And I started learning about these fairly bleak things that had happened. Then, unexpectedly, I started learning about this set of organizations at the national and also the local levels doing incredible work to try to challenge what I think are among the most powerful corporations on earth, these major media companies. They call themselves the media reform movement. There are branches of it, media justice, for example. But what they're saying is we have gotten ourselves into a bind in this country. We now have a media system. It's misled us into a war. It's by giving us misinformation. It's misserved us at home by giving up on public interest programming. It's made our cultural life less interesting. Let's do something about it. And I would say that there are three big branches of this movement. On the one hand, there are people who started doing a lot of independent media production. Some are doing their own blogs or local websites. Others have set up radio stations. I write about the rise of amateur and pirate radio and low-power FM radio. Some do their own independent journalism. But indie media has become a force in this country, and they're kind of do-it-yourselfers in cities of all shapes and sizes, doing really interesting things that I'm quite excited about. And the internet is this terrific medium for allowing their work to circulate. There's also people who are kind of watchdogs of the media. So the second branch is what I think of as media criticism. Groups like FAIR, but there are also right-wing organizations, Parents Television Council, that try to monitor the media offerings in their hometowns and see what are corporations doing. And the Parents Television Council is very interesting on this score. They got very upset because they realized there was a lot of stuff they thought of as indecent on the airwaves, and the community programming didn't fit the standards of a lot of places where they have high membership. And this is a Christian conservative organization that's concerned about decency in broadcasting. And they did some research, and they discovered actually that the companies that were putting the most indecent material on the air were actually the biggest media chains out there, the clear channels that didn't actually care about the community standards in any respect. So, while Clear Channel has avowedly right-wing politics and makes contributions to conservative candidates at a rate that's far disproportionate to its contributions to Democrats, and most businesses tend to hedge their bets, but not Sinclair, not Clear Channel. The chains were actually putting all this kind of filthy content on the air. So the Parents Television Council was a watchdog that started to fight for local control, and so that's kind of the second part of it. The third part, which in a way is the most exciting for me, is the emergence of this media policy campaign. And there are campaigns on many different levels of people who've said, enough of this deregulation, and enough of this fix on gutting the ownership laws and allowing fewer and fewer companies to own more and more of our media system. They started really in earnest in 2003. In 2003, Michael Powell was the chairman of the FCC. Powell is Colin Powell's son, and he is a kind of free market fundamentalist, and even a libertarian pundit, William Safire, said, Powell's a guy who never saw a merger he didn't like. And Powell decided he was just going to revolutionize the media ownership system, just allow the market to work, get rid of all of these caps. And he tried to push through to the American people a set of laws that would have allowed unprecedented levels of consolidation. Well, it turns out that Americans had had enough. And so an organization called Free Press started to, which just was created, a few months before, started to organize all the different groups that had been working on these issues. And so, on the left, groups like Move On and the ACLU and Now and Code Pink were working with, on the right, the Parents Television Council and the Christian Coalition and the National Rifle Association. And this is an unlikely coalition. It doesn't happen very often. And when it does, you should note, something is going on here. There must be something seriously wrong. They together pushed Americans to send something like 3 million letters and emails to Congress and the FCC saying, enough with these proposals to allow radio stations to own even more, to allow cross-ownership so a newspaper can also own a local television station. Enough. And Powell ignored them. Powell literally ignored the 3 million letters. He said, this is 19th century politics. And he said, we have modern science, and the science tells us that the media system is not so bad. It's still competitive. It's still local. But then the FCC order got challenged by Congress, and then it got challenged in the courts. And there's an amazing story. A little pirate radio operation called Prometheus Radio Project, based in West Philadelphia, challenged the FCC in a lawsuit, the Prometheus Radio Project versus the FCC. And they said, your grounds for imposing these rule changes that would deregulate the media more are totally unsound. And then the court did a very serious evaluation. And they looked closely at this FCC science. Powell said, we've got science on our side. Well, what was that science? Well, according to Michael Powell's FCC science, if you want to understand the influence of different media in the same market, you can give them weight based on, how many people they reach. And we need to understand that to think about whether one company can truly dominate a market. Well, in the FCC measure, officially, in New York City, the Dutchess Community College public access television station was more influential than the New York Times. That was the official FCC science that was guiding our media policy. Powell also assigned a couple of studies on local ownership in the media market. Does having a television station that's locally owned actually get you more local news? Well, the FCC economists who started researching into this discovered that, wow, actually, a locally owned and operated television station gets on average almost 5 minutes more local news per broadcast than a chain centrally owned place. That study got suppressed. It literally disappeared. It never hit the record, and no one even had heard about it until just a few months ago. In 2006, Barbara Boxer pulled it out of her bag at the confirmation hearing of the new FCC chairman, Kevin Martin, and a whole scandal broke out. So the FCC science was really shoddy, and the court said so. And what happened is Powell's attempt to radically deregulate the market even further failed. Basically got blocked in the courts. And so now we're at it again. This year, 2007, we are going to be fighting the same battles. The FCC, now under Kevin Martin, a former Bush staffer, is trying to push through another series of deregulatory moves that would allow fewer companies to own more of the media market. This coalition, this media reform coalition, is starting to get to work again. Another big thing that's happening has to do with the future of the internet. And here in Seattle, there are probably few media issues that are more significant at the policy level. And essentially, the telephone and cable companies that control our access to the internet want to change the way the internet works so that they can basically sell faster sites to deep-pocketed clients. That means that right now, if you're sitting in your house and you're connected to your PC online, you can get all sites at basically the same speed. they want to make it so that, let's say, Amazon and Barnes & Noble are competing for the book market online. Well, Comcast would like to be able to say to them, we will provide much faster service to the company that pays us at Comcast more to do that, like basically turning the internet system into a cable box. And when you think about the fact that in the near future, we will be getting almost all of our media through broadband connections, not just websites, but also, videos and television shows and movies and music, even telephone service, all kinds of programming. The pricing system that they're talking about doing would radically transform the way that all this works. It would, essentially favor the biggest corporations and block innovation. It would prevent, the entrepreneurial, energy from actually creating successful new sites. Sites like eBay or even Amazon or Google would be far less likely to emerge in a system where the incumbent players controlled the fastest access. So Congress started to push through this bill last year in 2006. And literally in 3 weeks, a new coalition called SaveTheInternet.com, which included Free Press and both those factions on the left and the right, got 1.5 million Americans to write letters to Congress in 3 weeks saying, do not change the way the internet works. There is no public benefit from getting rid of net neutrality. And amazingly enough, they blocked that bill from going through. So now, in 2007, with Democrats in control, there's a bill that would actually protect network neutrality, preserve equal access to all websites. But the telephone and the cable industry is fighting very hard. They're investing quite heavily in their lobbyists, as they always do. And so it's an enormous battle. And, this is another, I think, really important message that this is a grassroots movement that has had tremendous successes. It blocked the 2003 order, it blocked net neutrality, but its future depends on the growth of the coalition. That is essentially, the industries are so powerful; they're doubling down their investments. I recently heard Ed Markey, the congressional Democrat who's now going to run the Telecommunications Committee in Congress, say that the communications industry has assigned an individual lobbyist to each member of Congress. The Center for Public Integrity put out a report saying in the last 10 years, media companies have contributed $500 million to political candidates. That doesn't even include lobbying. So the grip they have on the agencies that are regulating them, on the legislators who are regulating them, is quite strong. And the way to beat it, the way to relax that grip, is for citizens, ordinary people, to get involved in this movement and say, we've had enough and we're watching. And if you as an FCC member, or if you as a congressional official, especially here in our hometown, decide to support more deregulation, you're going to pay a price for it, because you're basically, you're basically ignoring the democratic wish of the American people.
All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you for spending time with us today. We've just been speaking with Eric Klinenberg. He is author of the new book, Fighting for Air: The Battle to Control America's Media.